Hello, Happy New Year, and welcome to your new look here at Economic Divide with me, Kaveh Taghwaee. To start off the year, we're going to be taking a look at the Saudi Arabian budget deficit, a deficit that has a sum of around 79 billion US dollars, something that will no doubt pinch the pockets of the world's largest oil producer. Now, for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the reliance on oil is something that is reflected heavily in its GDP. Yet, as we can see from this chart over here, the impact of the coronavirus on oil prices around the world was the second largest fall in history, when in March 2020, prices fell by 31.5%. So, how did the oil crash affect the Saudi GDP? Again, let's refer to this next graph that you see over here. We can see that until Q3 of 2019, that's the bar that you see here on Q3, GDP had a positive growth rate, yet with the arrival of the COVID-19 virus and a global fall in the demand for oil, the Saudi GDP slipped with Q2, seeing a 7.5% drop. That is reflected over here for Q2, and then moving on to Q3, that dropped to around 4%, as you see in this chart. Now, with uncertainty still surrounding a recovery, no wonder things are looking down for the Saudis. As ever, here on Economic Divide, we would like to encourage you to write in and tell us about some of the stories that matter to you. So drop us a line. Promise to get back to all of you. Let's now take a look at our first report and look at the global oil crash in more detail and see just how Saudi Arabia has been hit the hardest.
Things were looking very rosy for the bank account of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia over the last decade. With 266 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, the boom times certainly allowed the dollars to flow into the nation, allowing the despotic Saudi royal family to rule a reign of lavish luxury, whilst letting ordinary citizens slip into poverty. But in 2020, the world woke up to the impact of the COVID-19 crisis, a world pandemic that would affect the health and lives of millions and bring economies to their knees, and things were no different for the Saudis. Whereas the KSA has not been immune to the virus in terms of human costs. In fact, with 363,000 cases recorded and over 6,200 deaths, it's the impact on the economy that's truly hit home with Riyadh, with the GDP falling some 7.5% since the start of 2020. The reason for this has been the sharp drop in the price of oil. As the virus has clearly demonstrated over the last 12 months, the demand for fuel has slipped, falling from $71.34 a barrel in 2018 to a year low of just $9.12 per barrel in 2020, something that the Saudis were not expecting, it seems, as the national budget deficit is now a staggering 79 billion US dollars. To add insult to the injury, an economic war was triggered in March 2020 between the Saudi regime and Russia. With oil prices at the heart of the battle, the price sparked a quarterly fall of 65% in oil prices, with crude and Brent falling around 25%. The resulting oil war, as well as the effect of the COVID-19 virus, sparked a global stock market crash, costing trillions. With the world still yet to recover from the various impacting factors in 2020, things are not looking too bright for Saudi Arabia, with oil prices still low and a budget deficit that has hurt its economy.
Joining me in the studio today is Atifa Padidar. Atifa, welcome and Happy New Year to you.
Thank you.
It's good to have you with us here today. Okay, now before we get into details about the Saudi oil crisis, we spoke to Hossein Askari. He's a professor of international business at the George Washington University, and he's also a former board member on the IMF, and he was an advisor to the Saudi Ministry of Finance. Well, let's listen to what he said about how the crash has affected the Saudi economy and how the average Saudi is faring now compared to the so-called boom years.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's very nice to be with you. Let me just back up and say that when you look at the Saudi economy, it is very heavily oil dependent. Roughly 80% of Saudi Arabia's exports are oil, and about another 10% are oil related, namely plastics and petrochemicals. So when oil prices go down, Saudi Arabia is in trouble. And then the second issue is that the revenues of the country, government revenues, is about 75% comes from oil. And so when oil prices again goes down, government revenues goes down. And Saudi Arabia at the same time has some fixed expenditures that it tries to make. And those, I can list those, but basically, the important ones are domestic subsidies, military expenditures, also money for the large ruling family of Saudi Arabia, which is probably around 17,000 people. All of these things cost money, and so they have to spend that. So the country basically then runs into deficits, and Saudi Arabia has budget deficits of roughly 10, 12% recently. So this is not sustainable. And so when this happens, the simple guy on the road, on the streets, get actually squeezed. And so what you have to do, they can't squeeze them too much because then you have domestic problems. And so they run deficits. That's where it's at.
Okay, very well. Atif, with Saudi Arabia so heavily dependent on oil, as we know, how do you think that the price drop has impacted the economy there and in total or overall the Saudi regime? And also, do you think that the Saudi economy is going to be suffering as a result of this, and for what length of time? Some have said could be a few years.
Well, definitely, Saudi oil income contributes to 2/3 of its public revenues. So less oil money means financial trouble in public sectors, which directly affects the people of Saudi Arabia. Now, the government might start introducing measures like rising taxes. They have started with VAT. And introducing some austerity measures, which will not be welcomed by people of Saudi Arabia. They're not accustomed to this sort of situation. At the moment, a lot of people in Saudi Arabia are critical of the government because of the rising unemployment, which will continue due to these financial difficulties. And a lot of them are saying that this situation could be prevented if the government would spend less on military and stop the war in Yemen, which brought them nothing but international condemnation, and focus that money on their people. This situation wouldn't be happening.
Okay, very well. Thanks for that. Well, let's take a look now at how Saudi Arabia is trying to move away from their reliance on oil as bin Salman, the Crown Prince, tries to modernize the country, albeit to some quite rightly skeptical views from foreign nations of Saudi human rights records.
Bin Salman, the Crown Prince of the Saudi regime, ousted his nearest rivals in a bloodless coup that essentially made him the de facto ruler of the kingdom, going as far as imprisoning some of his relatives and even killing people who spoke out against him, none more so infamous than the brutal fashion in which the journalist Jamal Khashoggi met his fate at the hands of Bin Salman's murder hit squad. Part of the regime that Bin Salman wished to implement under his rule was the so-called 2030 vision, a plan that would see the kingdom introduce a strategic framework designed to reduce the nation's dependence on oil and concentrate on other sources of income. Many question whether this will be a success, with certain examples already proving to be a failure, with various sporting personalities refusing to attend high-profile events in the country. However, some have agreed, and some academics feel that the move away from oil onto more diverse projects has potential to succeed.
I think that the new approach, which is reflected in the broader 2030 vision, if implemented as outlined, it will take off. Now, that is contingent on the government and the leaders implementing, creating the environment which is very key for it to take off. This will include, of course, some of the things that I've already outlined in the vision, in particular, a continuation with the development of infrastructure.
But for bin Salman and his grand idea, there still lie several fundamental flaws in his approach. Firstly, as we've discussed, is the shocking history of human rights in the country, as seen in the murder of Khashoggi, but also the inequality between men and women, the notion of modern slavery in the kingdom, the terrible ongoing destruction of Yemen, and of course, the infighting between Saudi royals themselves, all lead many to question as to just how far this project can go, before it collapses. The idea, however, is something that other nations in the Persian Gulf region have also considered adopting, with the likes of the United Arab Emirates, for example, branching out into fields of tourism and technology, and the Persian Gulf state of Qatar, which is also thriving outside of its gas income, with the FIFA World Cup heading to Qatar next year, and of course the highly successful aviation industry, spearheaded by award-winning Qatar Airways, notably the only operator to thrive during the COVID-19 pandemic.
If you look at the Gulf countries, they both seem to have taken quite a similar path. They all seem to have developed a broader economic and political and social kind of framework, which they are implementing. I think the difference is that the pace of development is quite maybe slightly different, or the pace of the implementation is quite slightly different.
Joining us back in the studio is Hossein Askari. Professor, Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf states have taken huge steps to move away from economic reliance on oil, coming up with a range of alternative economic plans. Do you think that this tactic will work, or will setup costs prove too costly?
Well, I think that eventually, of course, oil runs out. And so any country has got to do something to make sure that this oil lasts in some fashion. Now, I am a firm believer in Islamic economics and what the Quran teaches about finance and economics. And it's very, very clear, no one with any brain can dispute this, that in Islam, what is under the ground, namely depletable resources, belong equally to all members of the present and future generations. But let me just say this, to be able to transform your economy from oil to something else, you need more than just a vision. You need more than just somebody saying, we're going to do this. You need to create a setup in a country where there is the rule of law and where there are incentives for the private sector to develop those things. Saudi Arabia has not done that. And so when you try to, as a government, to try to set the direction for how you're going to go from an oil economy to a non-oil economy, it's very difficult for the government to say, well, we're going to pick this particular sector, that particular sector, and invariably it doesn't work. And until you have a setup, an environment, the condition for the private sector to flourish. And Saudi Arabia does not have that. So I think it'll be a very costly mistake in the long run, because it has not done the spade work in order to set up for a resurgence of the private sector.
Okay, not too optimistic there for Saudi Arabia. Atafa bin Salman has stated that he wants to diversify the Saudi economy, said that many times. And of course, he's talked about this 2030 vision that Professor there also talked about, the aim to boost tourism, infrastructure, leisure, recreation, things of that nature. But there have already been several boycotts of Mohammed bin Salman really in particular, and Saudi Arabia as a whole, by the idea about these big brand names and stars who want to actually make advancements, but they're concerned about the human rights record of Saudi Arabia. Do you think that this plan, this vision is going to work? Or do you think that Saudi Arabia actually has too many skeletons in its closet?
Well, Mohammed bin Salman established his authority through massive crackdowns on the dissent, locking up competitors in luxury hotels, ordering the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, waging a war in Yemen, and being involved in a blockade on Qatar. Now, these sort of behaviors discourage many investors, and a lot of investors in the future are thinking, is this a man that we want to work, a pro-violence, anti-democracy guy? They're looking for safe places to invest, especially with the ongoing pandemic and the financial crisis across the globe. So I don't think that the investors are going to be encouraged to invest in this vision. And at the same time, bin Salman was heavily reliant on the income from oil to make this dream happen. And with the drop in the oil revenues and the ongoing pandemic, I think his dream is dying away. Okay,
very well. Well, we're about to take a quick break here on Economic Divide, but don't go anywhere, as we have plenty more coming up, including more from Atafa and a new section of our show. It's called 1,000 Words. So don't go away. We'll be right back after this short message. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavitah Wai. Time now to take a look at a change of policy in Arab Persian Gulf states in our in-depth section. Now, as we have seen in recent months, several nations have normalized ties with the Israeli regime, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco. Many suggest that the Saudi regime may also follow the trend, but Riyadh appears to be stalling for now. Well, according to a report by Karen Uziel of Focus Economics, which was cited in this entry, she has stated that the biggest winner of the normalization of ties with the Israeli regime will be the poorest nation, that being Sudan. Yet between Israel, the UAE, and the U.S., a $3 billion fund promoting economic development will be launched, which may also tempt the Saudis. Now, she also has stated that for Saudi Arabia to fully and officially normalize ties with Israel will mean a change of power at the top, believing that bin Salman will have to replace his father for that to happen, which may spark huge protests and then in the process let down the people of Palestine. Well, the Israeli regime has offered to sweeten the deal with the Saudis by offering them an incentive, namely providing the so-called Iron Dome missile system once ties are normalized, something that the Saudi regime will no doubt at due time, due to its love of weapons, may jump at this. But for now, it has rejected it. Well, Israel itself is desperate for business. For example, check out this entry over here, an Israeli-Saudi Silicon Wadi to benefit both. Now, this is for the tech sector. An Israeli-Saudi union here will obviously benefit both, but Israel is looking to expand itself because of the fact that COVID-19 has affected countries around the world, and one of the main sources of income for the Saudis was the U.S. Cybersecurity, for example, is one of the fields, not to mention agri-tech, fintech, and digital health.
They say the difference between a man and a boy is the price of his toys. And this is no different for bin Salman, who since taking pseudo charge of the country has spent billions on military hardware, ranging from the latest fighter jets to the most devastating bombs, most of which come from Western suppliers, and in particular, the United States of America. But the military deals taking place are riddled with corruption, hence proving why so much spending has left the kingdom with such a huge deficit, all caused by the bad deals that allow certain individuals to profit in the process.
There have been, in fact, some military contracts in which the commission was larger than the actual contract, namely over 100%. There have been military contracts in which later on what are called the add-ons were larger than the initial contract, which also tells you that there was corruption going on, so they had to basically later on come and add money to it to make up for it. Namely, the contractor was told what was the highest other bid, so that or the lowest other bid, I'm sorry, so they could go below that. So there are all of these things why the military contracts occur.
However, for the cameras, the corruption is not an issue, as the likes of Trump and bin Salman laugh and joke about billion-dollar contracts, which Trump labelled as peanuts to the Saudi regime. The final destination of the weapons and bombs bought from the US and the UK is no laughing matter. Bin Salman's also been the mastermind and chief instigator of the ongoing war in Yemen, where the very deal signed by the Saudis to buy US weapons has seen over 233,000 people killed in the country at the hands of Saudi attacks and sanctions. With the war looking like an unwinnable mission for Riyadh, it seems that the excessive spending on military hardware, some of which has never been used, either through lack of knowledge as to how to use it or simply not having had the opportunity to do so, has meant that the overall budget on the war has brought few tangible gains for the Saudi military. With estimates placing the Saudi spending on the war in Yemen being at around $200 million per day, it's no wonder then that the Saudi budget has run down.
We're joined back in the studio with Atifeh, but before we head into our discussion, let's hear one more time from Professor Hossein Askari. We asked him a question about the Saudi military program.
The military expenditures, it's done for a variety of reasons. Let's just be very frank about it. Saudi Arabia cannot really defend itself. but it does not have anyone who wants to invade it. And if anyone does invade it, Saudi Arabia will get the backing of the United States military, and now I believe of Israel's. So why do they spend all this money on military? Well, I think it's number one is to reward the U.S. military complex, because the United States wants to export military hardware that reduces the cost of every unit that the U.S. military then buys. There's a second reason, and that is corruption. Is that in fact the commissions that are paid in military contracts are enormous. They run into the billions. So it's a way to channel money to various people inside and outside Saudi Arabia. I believe that much of that equipment is not against foreigners, but is to be used eventually if there is a domestic disturbance. And so it is pre-positioned for Americans to come and help the Saudi family out.
He was a great guest for this program. Okay, Atif, we have seen Donald Trump accepting billions of dollars from the Saudi regime, obviously in return for what Professor said there, for military weapons. This week actually saw another $290 million of arms being sold to Saudi Arabia, well, approved to be sold to Saudi Arabia. And this is a last push by Trump to arm, obviously, his friend, especially Mohammed bin Salman. Now, do you think that the incoming President Joe Biden, if he does actually get confirmed, is he going to be following Trump's footsteps, do you think?
Well, Saudi Arabia has been the United States' greatest ally in this region. I don't think that alignment is going to change with Biden coming to the office. But I think Biden is a man who cares about his international image, so he would be more careful the way he treats Saudi Arabia. But in terms of economic trades, I think there are going to be more trade deals between these two countries, especially now that the United States is in financial trouble itself. But in other things, I think regarding the human rights issues, Biden would be more careful to address these issues, things that, for example, bin Salman does, the thing that he does. I think that's the only thing that would change. That's it.
Very well. Thank you very much for your input. We appreciate it. Atif Payidar, researcher and journalist. Sure. We're always going to be seeing you again soon. To be living a lavish lifestyle, fueled by oil sales that provide easy income to spend on luxury goods, sophisticated military weapons, and most worryingly of all, buying the silence of the Western international community following the brutal assassination of journalist Jamal Khashoggi. But it seems that the impact of the coronavirus and the slump in oil prices have left the bank vaults of the Saudi regime with bare shelves, raising the question as to whether the kingdom is being mismanaged by a young, inexperienced, and power-hungry crown prince who is yet to understand the value of money. What now remains to be seen is whether oil prices will increase in the near future, and if so, what lies ahead for the Saudi regime, with outgoing President Trump causing Riyadh to lose yet another ally, and hence a possible reason why it is now extending the hand of friendship to Tel Aviv, something that many will no doubt condemn as an act of treason. That's just about all the time we have for this episode. I'd like to thank both Professor Hossein Askari and Professor Collins Nitman for being on the show. And on behalf of myself, Atif, and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.